On October 9th, 1769, the Tahitian Navigator Tupaia stepped on the shore of Aotearoa, New Zealand for the first time. A few months earlier, British Navy Lieutenant James Cook had brought Tupaia on board the HMS Endeavour as an expert navigator and translator as the ship explored the South Pacific. Now they were at the mouth of the Turanganui River, these days home to Gisborne's port.
But a day earlier, when Cook first arrived in Aotearoa, he didn't bring Tupaia with him, and the Endeavour's first meeting with Māori ended in disaster.
When Māori first encountered Cook's men opened fire and killed Ngāti Onione leader, Te Maru. A day later, 100 warriors of Rongo Whakata gathered on shore.
But Cook had realised his mistake. This time, he brought Tupaia on shore with him. And even though Māori had been separated from Tahiti and eastern Polynesia for 500 years, Tupaia understood them.
Tupaia stepped forward and introduced himself. It turned out they had more in common than language. They shared values like manaakitanga, roughly translated to hospitality, and whanaungatanga, connection.
But later, as Tupaia explored the Māori world, he saw things which were totally unfamiliar.
He saw kumara planted in rows of mounded earth and stored in deep pits.
He saw the huge wood and earth defences of Pa, fortified villages.
He saw elaborate curved patterns on wooden carvings and in tamoko or tattoos.
None of it was anything like what Tupaia knew from home in Tahiti.
During their 500-year separation from the rest of the Pacific, the people of Aotearoa had transformed.
How? What changed? Well, that's what this episode's all about. The 500-year evolution of Māori.
Tēnā tātou katoa, I'm Marnie Dunlop.
And kia ora, I'm William Ray.
And this is the Aotearoa History Show.
People often talk about Māori culture before Tupaia arrived as if it was just a single thing. And that's totally wrong. Māori were a network of tribes and confederations, each with their own history and way of doing things.
When Tupaia visited these islands in 1769, nobody in Aotearoa called themselves Māori. The word literally just means ordinary, and it only became common later in the 19th century when people needed a word to distinguish Indigenous New Zealanders from European colonists. There's also a tendency to imagine Māori as a people frozen in time. But of course, over 500 years, any society is going to change a lot.
When people study Māori history before European contact, they usually divide it into three phases. First, the earliest phase of arrival and occupation, currently estimated to run from sometime in the late 1200s to around 1400 AD. This is when the first waka arrived and people spread out around the motu, or islands. Archaeologists and historians call this the colonisation phase, which is a bit confusing because we usually talk about Pākehā colonisation, and that didn't happen until 500 years later.
Next, the transitional phase, roughly 1300 to 1600. Moa became extinct, the climate changed, and there was huge social upheaval as people had to rely more on agriculture for food.
Finally, the traditional phase, approximately 1500 to 1800 AD. This is when the cultural structures we see as distinctly Māori were embedded, but society was still changing. There were huge migrations and increasing collaborations within and between tribes.
And these three phases happened at different times and in different ways in different parts of Aotearoa. Like down south, the tribes of Ngaitahu relied entirely on hunting, fishing and other wild sources of kai, all the way up until the 1800s. Whereas in the far north, Te Hiku, people were likely growing crops early on, taking advantage of the warmer climate.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What do we know about the people who first settled Aotearoa? Well, we know they came from eastern Polynesia, probably in or near Tahiti, maybe Rarotonga. The latest evidence suggests several hundred people made the voyage here, aboard multiple waka. They lived in groups of roughly 50 to 100, made up of a handful of whānau, extended families.
Well, the whānau in a tribe could trace their heritage back to shared tipuna, ancestors. Tribes were often named after a female tipuna, which helps to explain why the Māori word for sub-tribe is hapu, which also means pregnant.
Yeah, emphasises shared ancestry.
But that doesn't mean everyone was equal. This hierarchy started long before Polynesians arrived in Aotearoa. It was largely determined by Whakapapa, or ancestry.
The chiefs, rangatira, were often the eldest sons and daughters of the eldest sons and daughters, going way back to ancestors described as descended from gods. This meant they were particularly tapu and therefore held a lot of mana, spiritual power and authority.
These first people all came within 100 years of each other, on deliberate voyages starting around 1270 AD. Well, at least that's the current best estimate. Their descendants rapidly spread out around Aotearoa and outlying islands. Some hapu travelled hundreds of kilometres from mainland New Zealand to places like Rangitahua, Maikahuka and Norfolk Island.
Experts believe stone tools found on Australia's east coast might belong to voyagers from these outlying islands.
The locations of tools and moa bones sometimes mark the sites of kainga, villages or camps. Looking at what's left at these camps tell archaeologists quite a bit about the people who lived there.
For one thing, early kainga were only occupied for a couple of decades at most. They weren't permanent villages. Second, they're often found near river mouths and sit next to huge piles of bone and shell.
It looks like early Māori would sail along the coast in their waka, stopping at a river mouth and set up camp. Then they would travel inland, hunting moa and other large birds, and along the coast harvesting fish, shellfish and seals. When these food sources ran out, they simply moved on.
These camps are also interesting because of the stuff we don't find. For one thing, there are very few weapons. Those only turn up later. So maybe this phase, when Māori first occupied Aotearoa, was more peaceful than later phases. Or maybe weapons in this era were made of wood rather than stone, so they rotted before archaeologists could find them. Or maybe they were so valuable their owners carried them away.
So many question marks. There are different ways of interpreting the evidence, but most experts think this early phase of Māori arrival, exploration and occupation was relatively peaceful. For the first 100 or 200 years, there were so few people and so much kai food that there wasn't much need to fight and lots of reasons to cooperate.
Instead of weapons, archaeologists find tools, particularly toki, types of adze. We find toki all over Aotearoa and some of the outlying islands. Most of these tools are made from a stone called argillite, and they're mostly made in the same place, Wairau Bar.
Archaeologists digging at Wairau Bar have found nearly 40 tonnes of argillite chips, leftovers from making toki. That means hundreds must have been made at the site every year. It was a little toki factory. Archaeologists
have also uncovered giant umu, cooking pits filled with the bones of thousands of moa and seals, plus 1,600 tonnes of shells.
Wairau Bar also has something we don't find at other early Māori settlements, a cemetery, urupa. The bones of roughly 60 people have been discovered there.
When archaeologists analysed those bones closely, they discovered some of those people had diets which were high in sugar and low in protein.
Now that suggests they grew up in tropical Polynesia eating sugary fruit, not in cold New Zealand eating moa meat. So these might be the bones of the very first people to come to Aotearoa.
So what does this all mean? What was Wairau Bar for? Well, Aotearoa was a weird landscape. It was different from the tropical islands the first migrants came from, bigger, wetter, colder, and these early arrivals needed a place where different hapu could gather together, tell each other what they'd discovered, which foods were poisonous, which were good to eat, and to trade with each other.
They needed a place to reinforce connections, share gossip and memories of the old days, whakawhanaungatanga.
And for expert toolmakers to practice their craft and teach it to the next generation.
So, archaeologists think of Wairau Bar as basically New Zealand's first capital city.
But within 100 years, Wairau Bar was abandoned, probably because local food sources ran out.
To tell the story of Wairau Bar, we're relying almost entirely on archaeological evidence. That's because oral histories of these early days of Māori occupation focus on stories of rangatira travelling around Aotearoa claiming land for their hapu, but they don't talk much about the details of day-to-day life. Writing about the oral traditions of the Tainui people, famous Ngāti Maniopoto historian Dr. Bruce Biggs wrote this. For the first 7 or 8 generations, little but personal names are recorded in pedigrees stemming from just a few of the immigrants. Then beginning with Tāwhao in 1475, the tradition suddenly becomes more detailed. It is an astonishingly detailed record, matched in the Pacific only by other Māori tribal histories, all of which seem to follow a pattern of sparsely recorded remote past, followed by a sudden efflorescence of detail beginning 3 to 4 centuries ago.
That explosion in the oral tradition marks a turning point in this new Māori culture, the start of the transitional phase. And historians think this pretty much comes down to kai. Moa and seals reproduced slowly, and their populations couldn't cope with the amount of hunting going on. By 1450 AD, the last moa had vanished, and the seal population had been decimated.
So why did Māori hunt these animals so heavily? Well, in the tropical islands Māori came from, they hunted animals that had evolved to reproduce quickly. It helped them cope with disasters like typhoons and tsunamis. Aotearoa's animals evolved in a more stable environment, so they became slow breeders to avoid overpopulation.
It seems likely that after the extinction of the moa, Māori learned to manage natural resources. They probably used rahui, temporary bans on gathering those resources in certain areas.
And we still use that now. But with the extinction of large animals like moa and seals, most Māori had to fall back on a food they had brought with them from the tropical islands, the kumara. To grow a decent crop, kumara needs the average temperature to stay above 15 degrees for 5 months. In tropical Polynesia, that means 2 harvests a year.
But if you hadn't already noticed, Aotearoa is not a tropical island. So it was only possible to get 1 crop a year, and only in what we'll call the kumara zone, northerly coastal parts of the country where it's a little bit warmer.
So this was a time of massive migration. During the early phase of Māori occupation, settlements were evenly distributed across Te Ika'amaui and Te Waipounamu, the North and South Islands. But by the end of the transitional phase, about 98% of Māori lived inside the Kumara zone. The remaining 2% lived in the southern North Island and parts of the South Island, where they migrated between seasonal sources of kai. The more remote islands were completely abandoned, probably because they were too small to sustain a permanent population. The only exception was the Moriori people on Rekohu, Wharekauri, the Chatham Islands, and we'll tell their remarkable story in another episode.
As you'd imagine, the switch from moa to kumara as the primary source of food led to huge societal changes. You had to stay near your kumara pretty much all year to tend them and make sure that someone didn't come along and steal them. So Māori had to set up permanent settlements, and it became really important to know which land belonged to your hapu and which belonged to your neighbour.
This is why we see that explosion in detail of the oral tradition around 1500 AD. Like if you were a rangatira and you caught someone trespassing on your land, how did you prove it was yours? You used your Whakapapa. You said, hey, my tipuna claimed this land hundreds of years ago and have held it ever since. I can tell you their name, I can tell you how they did it, I can tell you the names of all of their descendants up until today. Reciting Whakapapa asserts both your rights to land and your identity. The two are connected. Any transfer of land or resources through marriage or warfare or gifting is also recorded in these stories. So the oral histories get more detailed as land becomes more valuable. They are a library, a legal record, and a family tree all in one.
On top of the extinction of the moa and the decline of other large animals, Māori faced another big change in the transitional phase from 1300 to 1600, the beginning of the Little Ice Age, several hundred years of global cooling and rapidly changing weather patterns. Historians think the Little Ice Age reduced harvests and increased competition for farmland and other sources of kai. This didn't just affect Aotearoa, it's linked to disruption and cultural change all over the Pacific. Pretty much everywhere, from Fiji to Timor to New Zealand, we start seeing more signs of warfare in the archaeological record, more weapons and more defensive fortifications.
We also get more mentions of violence and battles in Māori oral histories.
But just because warfare was increasing doesn't necessarily mean it was common. Māori had ways of trying to resolve disputes without bloodshed. One of the most important was Tawa Muru. Say you're a rangatira. and your neighbour insults you or hunts in your hapu's patch of forest or takes fish from your stream, you could launch an all-out war against them, but that would be an overreaction, like life in prison for stealing a packet of chips. The punishment needed to fit the crime. You needed utu.
Utu is a key concept of tikanga, Māori customary law. It's commonly mistranslated as revenge, but it actually means something more like rebalancing, cost or reparation. We can understand utu a bit better by looking at it as one of three interlocking concepts: take, utu, ea. Take, an action or issue, demands utu, an appropriate response, resulting in ea, balance.
Coming back to our example, launching a war for a minor insult or trespass wouldn't be an appropriate utu. It'd be an overreaction and costly for everyone, and it might prevent both sides from achieving a state of ea.
So instead, people on both sides agreed to a Tawa Muru, which was sort of like a relatively non-violent plundering raid, a way of publicly righting a wrong that fell short of actual combat.
Of course, Tawa Muru couldn't resolve every dispute. When violent conflict did happen, it was usually utu for a more serious take, like for the murder of a rangatira or for a dispute over resources.
The growing threat of warfare in the transitional phase led to the building of pa, defensive fortifications.
Thousands of pa pop up around Aotearoa, almost all inside the kumara zone. Some were just small forts to protect kumara pits, others were much larger.
The biggest was Maunga Kiakia Pa, One Tree Hill in Auckland. In the 1700s, it covered 17 hectares and could protect 5,000 people in times of crisis.
Pa also had religious significance. In fact, when Tupaia saw his first pa, he didn't think of them as fortifications at all, but more like giant temples.
And in a way, he was right. Pa often contained carvings of atua and important ancestors. Senior rangatira lived at elevated positions within pa, which were tapu spaces. Particularly large and elaborate pa enhanced the mana of the rangatira who lived there and of their wairehapu.
And pa weren't the only status symbols. Through the transitional phase, archaeologists start finding elaborately carved ornaments, tools, weapons and waka. Some archaeologists say this suggests an increasing hierarchy, a growing gulf between higher-ranking rangatira and lower-ranking common people.
Several European explorers and missionaries commented that Māori were more conscious of social status than other Pacific people, although we have to be careful about these kinds of European observations. For one thing, they interpreted what they saw through a European worldview, often failing, quite a lot actually, to fully understand nuances in te ao Māori.
These Europeans were also observing Māori at a time when they'd turned up out of nowhere. Imagine if aliens landed in New Zealand today and wrote down what they saw. I doubt we'd be acting normally.
Maybe not you. These new pa, waka and weapons we find in the transitional phase are also often decorated with new kinds of art. Alongside the traditional rectilinear art styles of Eastern Polynesia, we start seeing the curved, flowing designs which we think of today as distinctly Māori. This might partly reflect that during the transitional phase from 1300 to 1600, Māori were learning to work with new materials they found in Aotearoa. There was fine-grained tōtara timber, the bones of seals and whales, tohora, and most of all, pounamu.
Pounamu was super useful for Māori, a beautiful mineral soft enough to be shaped into jewellery and hard enough to make an effective tool or weapon. So it's not surprising Pounamu was especially prized as a symbol of mana. Some hapu migrated across Cook Strait especially to access the land they called Te Waipounamu, the waters of greenstone.
Pounamu was so important to Māori, still is, that it was traded all over New Zealand, but they weren't using cash. Instead, Māori used a system of gift exchange, kind of like a mental IOU. A good example of this is kai haukai, the ceremonial exchange of kai of food. Your whānau might harvest birds in summer months, you'd preserve some to eat in the winter, but also to give some to other people within or beyond your hapu. So later that year, when your stock of preserved birds were running low, your neighbour might harvest inanga, whitebait, and share that with you. Mean deal.
Kai haukai was particularly important in the South Island, where it was too cold to grow kumara. Instead, the hapu of Ngāi Tahu traded seasonal sources of kai to keep everyone fed all year round.
This kind of utu-based trade is still important to many Māori today, and it has deep roots in Māori history. We already mentioned how toki made at Wairau Bar were distributed far and wide in the earliest phase of Māori history. At the same time, we find knives made from obsidian sourced from Tuhua Mea Island in the Bay of Plenty. Those obsidian blades are spread everywhere from Rakiura Stewart Island to Rau Islands in the Kermadec.
Evidence of long-distance trade is harder to find in the transitional phase. Archaeological evidence shows Māori were mostly making stuff using local resources. It's another sign hapu were becoming more closely tied to their land. When they did trade, it was almost always with closely related hapu. And that makes sense, right? You'd only give an IOU to someone you trust, and for Māori, that usually meant relatives.
The transitional phase of Māori history never really ended. It just flowed into the traditional phase, the phase Māori were in when Tupaia and Cook landed at Turanga in 1769. But this wasn't the end of Māori cultural evolution, not by a long shot. Looking at the oral histories and material culture, plus written European accounts of Māori in the early 1800s, it's clear the culture was still changing.
Why? Well, for one thing, the climate had changed again. By 1650, the Little Ice Age was ending, Aotearoa became warmer and drier. As the Kumara zone expanded, some hapu migrated away from heavily populated northern parts of Aotearoa.
We also start to see more collaboration between closely related hapu and the growing importance of wider iwi groups. The word iwi also means bones, symbolising the deeper connections of hapu. They are typically named after ancestors who arrived on the first waka to Aotearoa.
Iwi connections became increasingly important to hapu in the traditional phase. There were also increasing alliances between iwi as time went on. In the late 1700s or early 1800s, the paramount leader of Ngāti Toa, Pikauterangi, got into a major dispute with other hapu of Waikato and Maniapoto, in particular Ngāti Apakura.
Pikauterangi reached out to his relatives, and they reached out to their rallies. Together, they formed a massive alliance of iwi and hapu, including Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu, Te Atiawa, and Ngāti Ruanui, Morakru. Together, they planned an attack on Pikauterangi's enemies.
In response, the hapu of Waikato, Ngāti Maniapoto, and Ngāti Apakura made an alliance.
They got Ngāti Whātua and hapu of the Hauraki Gulf involved too. It was a large, diverse alliance of different iwi, but they agreed that in battle they would all follow the commands of an ariki, a paramount leader, Te Rauangaanga of Waikato.
This all ended with the Battle of Hingakaka near Tawa Muru. This may have been the biggest battle ever fought in Aotearoa. It's said to have involved thousands of warriors, some say as many as 16,000.
Pikauterangi and his allies had the advantage of numbers, but their leadership was divided. Each hapu was commanded individually by its own rangatira. Meanwhile, his opponents were unified under the leadership of Te Rauangaanga.
So, in the end, Pikauterangi and his allies were defeated.
In the traditional phase from 1500 to 1800 AD, oral histories make increasing reference to rangatira and their hapu banding together under the mana of ariki, paramount leaders like Te Rauangaanga. It wasn't just about warfare. Often multiple hapu worked together to celebrate important occasions, create new gardens and build new pa.
And while these projects were often organised by ariki, decisions were made collectively. The wishes of ariki could be overruled if their people disagreed with them.
The arrival of Tupaia and James Cook marked the beginning of the end of the traditional phase, and many other things. But it's interesting to imagine what might have happened if that contact never happened. This was a time of significant cultural and societal change for Māori. Who knows where it might have led?
But as more and more Māori began speaking, working and living with visiting explorers, whalers and missionaries, and Aotearoa was pulled into the expanding British Empire, Māori society would change once again.
But that's a story for a different episode. But for now, that's us. Hei kona. Kia ora, thanks for watching our show. If you want to know more about the history of Māori and Aotearoa before the arrival of Europeans, we've put links to some of the resources we use in the description. One we found particularly useful was Tangata Whenua, an illustrated history by Atholl Anderson, Judith Binney and Aroha Harris. Hei kona.